We want to get to the bottom of the legal and constitutional implications of this method of appropriating money, if we can call it that, and talk to Robert Weissman of Public Citizen. I think they're filing a lawsuit. Robert, how you doing?
Doing great. Glad to be with you.
It's been a while now. I'm about to go to my 20th reunion for my law school. We had learned that the president got to do a certain number of things, and Congress got to do a certain number of things, and spending money on a dubiously defined emergency, I didn't remember that part, but maybe it's new law. How should we be thinking about this from a legal or constitutional standpoint?
I think the Constitution has not been amended since you were in law school, and your recollection is correct. So what Trump is trying to do is circumvent the express intent and will of Congress on a spending decision in order to secure funds to build a racist wall. It's both objectionable on the merits, of course, but also as a constitutional matter. If the president is able to override or ignore Congress in its area of core authority, the spending decisions that you were talking about, simply by declaring an emergency for a fictitious and made-up problem, it's very hard to know what the limits of his emergency powers actually would be.
What are the examples that would be closest to this of application of emergency powers in the past, where money has been appropriated and stuff done without congressional approval?
Well, there is no example that's comparable to this. There have been the sort of modern emergency law, if there's such a thing, goes back to the mid-'70s when Congress created the National Emergencies Act to create a framework for how presidents should declare emergencies, and there's a whole bunch of other statutes that reference emergencies. Since that time, there have been several dozen emergencies declared. They mostly involve foreign policy matters and are usually used as a basis for imposing sanctions, or they involve national disaster-type situations. There have only been a couple times when the president actually used the national emergency to move money around, and they were in cases of actual emergencies. For example, following 9/11. They weren't fake emergencies, and they weren't designed to override Congress. They were just designed to move really quickly.
In terms of, I was thinking of an analogy, maybe it's it's a 180 degrees different one, but it sort of seems to me we could view this as a flip side of a line item veto, where if the line item veto being where the president can cherry pick elements that have been appropriated and say, we will not appropriate those elements. And this would be kind of the converse of that, where the president can add things to the budget even if Congress doesn't say so. What's the current state of law on the line item veto, or what's a better analogy for us to understand the precedent here and understand how courts might treat this?
Well, the state of law on line item veto is the president can't do that. And the president absolutely can't do this. When this gets to the courts, and it's going to, we're suing, others are going to be suing, there's just no guarantee about how the courts are going to answer, because the law on a national emergency is somewhat vague, and because you just can't rely on the courts now to defend civil rights or separation of powers or any constitutional principle. But the core idea is exactly as you remember from law school, or people might remember from Schoolhouse Rock. Congress does the spending. Congress determines the spending decisions, and the president doesn't get to say, I don't like what you did, I'm calling an emergency, and the rules are off. That is not how the system is designed to work. And it's so much so not designed how the system is supposed to work that if the president can do that, if he can directly contradict what Congress wants simply by crying emergency, it's really hard to know what the limit is to the next time he wants to do it. And it's not necessarily just about spending decisions. Say he wants to deploy the military on the streets of major American cities because he says there's too much anarchy, and he wants to clamp down on protests, or he wants to round up people of color because of some alleged gang threat to national security. Those things are not out of the imagination if he's able to get away with this one.
And again, I'm trying to think of, or I guess get you to think of, their best arguments. Their best, I mean, if they could say, well, yeah, there have been applications of military force which requires the spending of money, even if the money has not yet been was not specifically appropriated for that application of military force prior to a congressional declaration of war, and sometimes even with there never being a congressional declaration of war. He said, well, this is sort of like that, but the war is against El Chapo Guzman and MS-13, and even though, yeah, we're building the wall on U.S. land or halfway in between, the president has some heightened powers when it comes to international interactions. What would either be ways to strengthen that argument to build up this straw person, or how is what I said patently absurd?
Well, that is what they're going to say. They're going to say it's national security, it's drug trafficking and threat to the homeland. As you know, once you say national security, you get a lot more leeway automatically from the courts because they just get scared and become very deferential to the president. And they're going to say that the National Emergencies Act gives the president a lot of latitude to define what an emergency is. So those are things that we can say with some confidence they're going to say, and that Trump, in his incoherent way, sort of said actually in his press conference this morning. The problem is, of course, the facts. There's just absolutely no emergency. There's no emergency sense of urgency, period. And we know that even if you believe everything Trump says, which obviously you shouldn't, but even if you did, there's no sense of urgency around this. The problem has persisted. Trump himself said in the press conference he didn't actually have to declare an emergency. He could have waited until later. And he hasn't treated it like an emergency during the many months of the negotiation over this appropriation. Of course, beyond just the sense of timing, though, of course, the humanitarian problem at the border that he refers to is a problem of his own making, and it's not one that could be solved by a wall, nor is it one that threatens national security. The problem at the border is that Trump is illegally preventing people who are seeking asylum in the United States from entering the country. That's why they're lined up at the border, because of Trump, not because of the absence or presence.
And I want to get to a piece of that, not only the self-created emergency, but the definition of emergency. And I try to think about the kind of opinion that could be written by some judge. And I can relatively easily understand how an injunction should be written against the president, how this could be blocked. I understand at least what the arguments that could be said. I'm trying to figure out, if you wrote it the other way, if public citizen, if you file your lawsuit and if you lose, what that opinion looks like. And I've written, I wrote judicial opinions, and I'm trying to think what it'd write, because you'd have to write a definition of emergency, and if you did, that definition of emergency, based on everything you just said, would be so expansive, it's hard for me to imagine what it would essentially equate emergency with urgency. Emergency was something that felt really, get rid of the urgency and equate emergency with something that just is important. And the definition of what is important would be not rule of law, but rule of person. And I'm trying to figure out what else, like how you would weave that argument to have any precedent that would be sensible, unless you just baldly say the definition of emergency was whatever the president says it is. Last word by you.
I think the last thing you said is exactly where they're going to go with it if they rule against us and cannot take heart that the Supreme Court's going to deliver freedom and justice for us.
And you're filing a lawsuit.
We will be as soon as we possibly can. Yes.
People can find out more at Public Citizen. Thank you so much for talking to us, sir.
Great to be with you.
We'll be back. This is Tom's show.